Okay, so just a reminder, we're not meeting next week as a result, and then we will reconvene, I guess, October 20th, to read the Dreyfus Affair, Chapter 4, um, which is the last part of the book on anti-Semitism. So let's actually officially get this going because there's a lot to talk about. Um, Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. This is the virtual reading group, and we are in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Specifically, right now, part 1, which is on anti-Semitism, and chapter 3 today of part 1, the Jews and society. Last week, we read the chapter, The Nation State and the Birth of Anti-Semitism. And we talked about political anti-Semitism. Political anti-Semitism for Arendt is when anti-Semitism, which is a modern ideology, turns dangerous insofar as it seeks to either discriminate politically or kill or imprison the Jews because they're Jews. And the way in which rising anti-Semitic movements, political anti-Semitic movements, come to be was the point of chapter 2. And her argument is that the key to this is that the law that emerges is that it's when a certain class finds that the state is opposed to their interests, they become anti-Semitic because the Jews have been associated with the state through a whole host of reasons, which we went into in reading that chapter. This chapter is about social anti-Semitism, the Jews and society. And it's a complicated one because we're not talking about laws and anti-Semitic parties, which you can follow and read about in history books. We're talking about something much harder, a phenomenon much harder to identify, which is social discrimination, social anti-Semitism. And there's two things that Arendt says about social anti-Semitism that are seemingly at odds and yet not, and yet very important. One is, and this is a controversial point, but it's one that we have to at least try and understand, which is that social anti-Semitism is not in itself so dangerous, right? So on page 55, she will say discrimination, however, as well as attraction, are politically sterile. And she'll say again on page 55, social antipathy for Jews with varying forms of discrimination did no great political harm in European countries. All right. That's an extraordinary claim to say that social anti-Semitism is not dangerous, does not do great harm. She doesn't say it's not dangerous. She says it's politically sterile and it doesn't do great harm. And so on the one hand, she will say that, and it's something we have to take seriously, is why she wants to say that. On the other hand, she wants to argue in this chapter that 20th century political anti-Semitism, which is dangerous, would not have gone the way it did and would not have been as dangerous as it was without social anti-Semitism. So on page 87, the end of the chapter, right, she'll say that political anti-Semitism depends upon an idea of the Jew in general that is a product of social anti-Semitism. So on the one hand, she wants to say social anti-Semitism is politically sterile and is not as dangerous and not really politically dangerous. On the other hand, you would not have had the political danger of political anti-Semitism without the rise of social anti-Semitism. And so that helps then explain what this chapter is trying to do, which is to say that in the 1920s and 30s, we saw, and actually even before that, in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, we saw the rise of what Arendt calls the mob, which is a term we'll have a chance to talk a lot about as we read through this book. But the mob, she says, saw the Jews easily as the key to history and a central cause to all evils. Now, they do so politically, as I said before, when they see the state as an obstacle to their interests and they associate the Jews with the state. But what she's saying is that in this chapter and making important connections with is that the prior history of Jews in society prior to the rise of political anti-Semitism, she says, must contain elementary indications of the hostile relationship between the mob and the Jews. And so we're reading, it's a strange chronology as well in the book, because we first read the chapter 2 on political anti-Semitism, which she thinks is the more politically dangerous version of anti-Semitism. And now we're going back and reading about the rise of social anti-Semitism, which was the precursor, or at least was what made possible and made more dangerous the rise of the more dangerous political anti-Semitism. Social, just to give you a quick definition, right? Political anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism that aims at the Jews as a group separate in society, associated with the state, and thus a group that is both separate and privileged from society and from other classes. Social anti-Semitism emerges not from the Jews' separateness, but from the rising equality of society. So she'll say on page 54 that social discrimination arose because of the growing equality of Jews with other groups. The idea here is that as society becomes more equal, what she calls the equality of condition, although this equality has many good things, right? And she's not against equality in any shape or form. She says it's a basic requirement of justice on page 54. She also thinks that this rising equality of modern society is, as she says, one amongst the greatest and most uncertain ventures of modern mankind. Why is equality so uncertain? The more equal conditions are, right? The more that Jews and Gentiles are seen as equal, or any other racial or minority group are seen as equal, the less explanation there is for the differences that actually exist between people. And thus, all the more unequal do individuals and groups become. Now, this is an idea that is shockingly simple, and yet I think foreign for many of us, because we so fully embrace the equality of condition that we are sometimes blind to its dangers. It's helpful to remind ourselves of those dangers. So, if you live in an aristocracy and you're part of the poor, you may be poor, but you don't think that your poverty is your fault, right? You think it's just the way society is structured. Richer, the aristocrats are rich, the workers are poor. But once the equality of condition comes along and we say all people are equal, then your poverty is not simply the way the world is, it's your own fault. And that's why you have thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Alexis de Tocqueville, who will say things like equality, democracy and equality, while they have great benefits, are two of the cruelest ideas that have ever been imported into the world. And they're cruel because they make any failure your own fault. If we're all equal, then our failure is simply something internal to us. And if that's the case, it can breed an enormous amount of resentment by those who are lower in status, because they feel internally denigrated as well as simply poor. And so for Arendt, the great challenge of the modern period and its particular danger is that we as persons, men, women, persons, for the first time confront each other without the protection of differing circumstances, right? And conditions. We're all supposed to be equal. And the problem is we're not equal. And when we then confront inequality, when we are actually supposed to be equal, we have to come up with a reason for that inequality. And that's dangerous. And she says there's, and this is one of, I think, the, again, it seems simple, but it's a line that's worth paying attention to on page 54, about 2/3 of the way down, where she says, whenever equality becomes a mundane fact in itself, whenever it's just an obvious thing that we're all equal, without any gauge by which it may be measured or explained, then there is one chance in 100 that it will be recognized simply as a working principle of a political organization in which otherwise unequal people have equal rights. One chance in 100 that when we embrace equality, we embrace it as political equality, that we're all have equal rights. She says, there are 99 chances out of 100, obviously, right, that it will be mistaken for an innate quality of every individual who is normal if he is like everybody else and abnormal if he happens to be different. So in its best form, with a 1 out of 100, equality means we all get equal rights. But in its perverted form, she says, this perversion of equality, of political into a social concept, the perversion of equality into a social concept suggests that we start accounting for differences by saying that people have innate differences, that there are normal and abnormal people, that there are good people and bad people. And the more society demands equality, the more it demands that we then explain differences through these kind of innate distinctions. And so this is the danger that social equality along with real life inequality and difference poses. And this is where she says, the more equal the Jewish condition, the more surprising were Jewish differences, right? The more Jews were considered to be part of an equal society with emancipation and rights, the more their differences, because they were different, became apparent and surprising. And she says this new awareness led to social resentment against the Jews, and at the same time, a peculiar attraction to them. And this simultaneous repulsion and attraction, resentment and attraction, discrimination and attraction, is what she's going to basically pursue throughout this chapter on Jews and society. And she's going to talk about how painful it is, right? I mean, there's going to be an enormous amount of pain in this writing. Hannah Arendt was a Jew who felt pressures to assimilate, to be a Jew and not be a Jew, to not be a Jew and yet be a Jew. And she found assimilation and the claim of assimilation deeply painful. And as painful as it was, right? And she writes an entire essay about this a little later called We Refugees, in which she talks about how almost everyone she knows who's a Jew in this situation contemplates suicide. So I just want it to be known, she understood the pain of social discrimination deeply. But she says here, discrimination was politically sterile and that it did no great political harm. And yet it is the prior condition that changes and elevates political discrimination later. And that's why she's trying to understand it. So if what is dangerous is not discrimination, but illegitimate discrimination or discrimination that breeds resentment, she's interested in how in Europe new cliques and new classes developed, and people accepted the wealth of the court Jews so long as that wealth didn't threaten them. And Jews accepted the discrimination against them as long as they could deny their religion and be accepted. And yet she says, if you have true equality of conditions, which they didn't have in Europe, but she thinks is at least in a kind of nascent state in America, it becomes even more dangerous because anyone who fails to be equal has no one to blame but themselves, as I mentioned earlier. And the question then is, how do the lower classes distinguish them from other lower classes? And how do wealthy people distinguish themselves from other wealthy people? And she says, in such a society, discrimination becomes the only means of distinction, a kind of universal law according to which groups may find themselves outside the sphere of civic, political, and economic equality. The point is that the more equal society is, the more we need to distinguish ourselves, the more we need discrimination. This is one of those Arendtian insights that I think when you really sit down and think about it, warps or makes you warp your current thinkings about the world, because she really does see something deep and important. She has a footnote at the bottom of page 55, which I at least want to point out, where she says that in America, in Europe, Jews stood out more than other groups in a homogenous population. But that doesn't mean that they're more threatened with discrimination than other groups in America. And she says, in fact, up to now, it's not the Jews, but blacks, the word she uses, Negroes, by nature and history, the most unequal of the peoples in America that have borne the burden of social and economic discrimination. Now, she's writing this in 1950. She doesn't mention political discrimination, which is because technically, you have the 14th and 15th Amendments. I think it's a mistake, but that's why she's doing it. But what she then says in the second paragraph of the footnote is that if a political movement ever grew out of this merely social discrimination, then Jews might very suddenly become the principal objects of hatred, more so than blacks, for the simple reason that they alone, among all other groups, have themselves, within their history and their religion, expressed a well-known principle of separation. This is not true of the Negroes or Chinese, who are therefore less endangered politically, even though they may differ from the majority, more from the majority than the Jews. This goes back to her claim before about what's really dangerous is not social discrimination or economic discrimination, but political discrimination. And that political discrimination is based on this separation of the Jews from the state, but also their connection to the state as given certain privileges. And And this is her argument here. We can obviously come back to this in the Q&A if people would like. The chapter then is divided into three parts. Between Pariah and Parvenu is the first part. The Potent Wizard on Benjamin Disraeli is the second part. And then on Vice and Crime is the third part. Between Vice and Crime. You know, as James said it before we started today, this can get pretty dense. And so there's no way I could take us through this line by line and step by step. But let's just make sure we understand some basic things. A pariah is a social outcast. And a parvenu is one who has recently come to either wealth or fame or power, and a reviste, someone who's a nouveau riche or something like that. She wants to say that there's no assimilation could ever be achieved merely by surrendering one's past. In a society on the whole hostile to Jews, it is impossible to assimilate. I'm sorry, it is possible to assimilate only by assimilating to anti-Semitism also, right? It's an important point. You can only assimilate into an anti-Semitic society by assimilating into anti-Semitism. And you can only assimilate into a racist society by assimilating into a racist society. And so that's part of her fundamental belief in the real pain of assimilation. Jewish emancipation, she says, requires an admission of Jews as Jews to the ranks of humanity. And that's what is very difficult to find here. In this chapter, or this part of the chapter, the point that she wants to make is that the acceptance of Jews into assimilated society depended on an incredibly painful bargain, that they had to admit that they were exceptional Jews. They had to be Jews and yet not be Jews, right? They had to be Jews and yet not be Jews. And that demand is at the root of social discrimination and the social anti-Semitism. We can talk about how it fits in with the claims of other groups that need to assimilate today as well, and I think have an equally painful experience. She says that education became the ticket for acceptance, both for the Jews and the Gentiles who accepted them. The Jews must be educated to separate themselves from being a Jew, namely a Jew in general, the bad Jew. And yet they were accepted into anti-Semitic society only because they were Jews. Because what people liked about them is that they were Jews who weren't Jews. They were exotic enough to be interesting and yet not Jewish enough to be needed to be excluded. This expectation to separate themselves from their people and to be exceptional specimens of humanity, to not disappoint, she says, has a terrible psychological impact on page 58. Namely, the Jews must be exceptional. They must try desperately not to disappoint, right? And I mean, you know, we've certainly, a lot of us have read about this around questions of race, the need to be an exceptional Black person, the talented 10th, whatever it is you want to call it. And many non-Jews, Gentiles, saw themselves, you know, as good, as new humanists, insofar as they welcomed these exceptional Jews into their society. And so she says both the Jews and the Gentiles, this is on page 61, both the Jews and the Gentiles sought to distinguish themselves from the Jew in general, the Jew who was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And so it was this social anti-Semitism and this social discrimination, not in political anti-Semitism, where was discovered the phantom of the Jew. This is on page 61. And this is the real core insight of this chapter, of the whole chapter, really, that social anti-Semitism was built upon the discovery of this phantom Jew. And the phantom Jew is this Jew who has sort of innate, inborn characteristics. Insofar as you're a Jew, you're Jewish. And look, just remember how silly that is, right? What is it? Are all Jews the same? Are all white people the same? Are all black people the same? No, everyone's different. There are so many different kinds of Jews. There's rich Jews and poor Jews. There's intellectual Jews and non-intellectual Jews. There's all sorts. And yet this need to distinguish yourself and to be an exception made both Jews and non-Jews start to embrace the idea that there was a Jew, an idea of the Jew. And that this leads in her mind to the emergence of the separation of what she would call Judaism from Jewishness. We lose Judaism as a religion or as a tradition, and we move towards Jewishness as an internal psychological trait. And so we move to what she calls the Jew as a psychological type on page 66. She says the Jews lost their common national or religious identity and became a social group defined by psychological characteristics of Jewishness. And she says there are three basic types. There's the assimilated pariah, right? The Jew as a humane, kind, sensitive to injustice. There's the parvenu, the arivist, the inhumane, greedy, servile, pushy Jewish businessman. And there's the conformist, the Jew who can enter society as an educated exception, yet one who is both a Jew in general and still a Jew, and yet also needs to not be a Jew. And then a fourth potential category of Jewishness is what she calls the conscious pariah, the idea of the Jew who consciously stands away from society, does not assimilate, does not conform, does not become a parvenu, stands apart and embraces their pariahdom, their outsider status, as a way of understanding or reflecting on society. This is the first section of the chapter on the pariah and the parvenu, and the way that Jewishness becomes a psychological trait of something called the Jew. The second part is called the potent wizard, and it's a case study, if you will, on one particular Jew, Benjamin Disraeli, who eventually became the prime minister of Great Britain, and looks at him as a psychological type, and someone who for a whole host of reasons has pride in his Jewish privilege, in his innate personality, his race pride. And so she sees him as someone who is able to, in a sense, articulate and manifest and be an example of a Jew who embraces the psychological type Jewishness and finds value in it, and embraces the race doctrines of Jews are different, Jews are better. And actually, because he believes that, for a whole host of reasons, which he goes into in part 2, she calls him a race fanatic. She thinks he is a race fanatic who really is a philo-Semite in some way, and believes Jews are better, and is able to use that in an anti-Semitic society like Great Britain, to become powerful, because he's both a Jew and not a Jew. He's able to walk that line of being conformist and be interesting and be exotic enough that people like him and find him, and yet also able to assimilate and conform. And yet he has this, idea: Judaism is beautiful, Judaism is powerful, and he's able to use that to push himself to ever higher heights. And so he becomes an example of both the way that this idea of the Jew as a social idea can be both negative but also quite positive at times. The third chapter of this, the first section of this chapter, is called Between Vice and Crime. And the basic argument here, and this is really, I think this is a brilliant 10 pages. The basic argument here is that the allowance of Jews into society was not because of a positive valuation of the Jew, right? So the allowance of assimilation, the allowance of Jews to enter into social clubs and social salons and social friend groups was not because people suddenly liked Jews, or not because they suddenly saw Jews as human beings. It was a fascination with vice. The point is that Judaism and Jewishness were seen as crimes, as seen as Jews were less than human. They were bad. They were these dirty, awful people. And yet, what happened was the criminality of Jews, the valence shifted. And so instead of being seen as criminals, they were seen as vices, or people with vices. A vice, she says, is simply a crime that is tolerated as a psychological or biological trait. The Jews could fascinate the Gentiles only because they could horrify them. And so the point is that the reason Jews could socially assimilate was not because Judaism ceased to be a crime, but it's because Jewishness, which was now distinguished from Judaism, right, as like something that's innate in my personality, not as part of a religion, Jewishness became a vice. And so by being Jewish, an exceptional Jew was seen at once as someone who was tarred by being Jewish, but also fascinating for being Jewish. And that vice and the rise of vice and the emergence of a love for vice was part of the decadence of 19th century society, in which the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy were increasingly bored and found the moral strictures of bourgeois society to be constraining and boring. And they brought in Jews and homosexuals into that society on the condition that the Jews and homosexuals would, on the one hand, both be Jews and homosexuals and also conform and not be Jews and homosexuals, as a way of fascinating the Gentiles and the bourgeoisie. In assimilating crime and transforming it into vice, society denies all responsibility and establishes a world of fatalities in which men find themselves entangled. In short, what makes us fascinating is that we're Jews, or we're gay, or we're Black, or we're trans, or whatever it is. And we become fated to our identities. We can't, on the one hand, we can't abandon our identities because we lose our social status. And yet we can't be our identities because then we would have no social status. And so we're constantly caught in between these two. And that's what she's talking about here. And for her, while on the one hand, it's obviously an advantage to be seen as someone who's merely a vice and not a criminal, because criminals can be punished and people with just a vice are tolerated, in fact, often celebrated. The difference is that a criminal at least can be punished. And if you're punished and then you serve your sentence and then you're back. Whereas if you're a Jew or a homosexual and you're considered to be someone who's just a vice, there's no way to get out of it. It's part of your identity. It's who you are. And so she'll say that such liberality, namely not seeing Jews and gays as criminals, but as merely people who have vices. She says this such liberality actually says that all Jews and homosexuals are murderers and may be discriminated against and treated differently. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to punish you because you're criminals. We're just going to discriminate against you. And this is the switch, right? This is the moment in which she says, we may be fascinated by people with vice, Jews and homosexuals, and we're not going to punish them, but we understand them as predisposed to be criminals. And that's what allows us eventually to move to the idea of liquidating or neutering them. And this is the point. 20th century anti-Semitism is political, but it depends upon this social idea of the Jew in general, the product of social discrimination. The Jew, as always, just on the edge between vice and criminality, who can be fascinating, but at certain moments when the mob takes over, we can move back from vice to crime and talk about liquidation. And that is sort of the arc of this chapter. I realized I talked a little longer than I usually do in these introductions. I apologize for that. This is a very complicated chapter. And I hope that was helpful in some way. Look, I also want to say, look, I'm talking about Jews, homosexuality, race. We're talking about social discrimination as potentially leading to political discrimination, but on itself, not as politically dangerous. These are explosive topics. I am thrilled you're here. And I hope we can talk about it in a thoughtful way. I find this to be an incredibly rich chapter, but difficult. Again, in the chat, please do be open to being criticized. Look, when I say that we should be respectful, that doesn't mean you can't be criticized, but you should be criticized for ideas, not for who you are. Let's just make that incredibly, it's always our practice, but remember it today. But don't be upset if people criticize your ideas, because that's part of why we're here. And if you want to speak to me and to everyone else, go to the reactions button down at the bottom of your page, hit raise hand and raise your hand. I am going to try and get through as many questions as we can. As a result, please keep your comments brief if you can. And we'll begin. Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much. I really, such a dense chapter, and I'd like to reiterate something that I suggested before about encouraging us to read this, specifically in terms of the present. And what really struck me in rereading this is how much the category of the social is perhaps something thought-provoking for the present. And I have to say that, for decades, I've been troubled by the category of the social. I read Hannah Pitkin's book on the attack of the blob when it came out, and I really just couldn't understand Arendt's obsession with formal equality over justice. And I just didn't understand what the threat of the social was. And here it seems in this historical discussion of anti-Semitism, if we think about it in terms of the broader category of the social and not just social anti-Semitism, and I think you're mentioning this, Roger, that we can see the dangers of what it means when we go for approaches or approach equality in terms of social equality as opposed to political equality. And I think it's very, very important that the solution for Arendt is political equality, that we recognize each other formally. And for me, it's really pressing right now because I feel that, as I mentioned before, that everything can be weaponized these days. And what we seem to have with certain present incarnations of the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda are things that are described by Arendt, and that is describing people as if they have immutable characteristics or providing solutions in terms of special privileges, as opposed to the formal equality of the original civil rights movement. And perhaps there's, a parallel between the weaponization of the philo-Semitism of Disraeli and the kind of weaponization of certain minorities who definitely deserve justice, but perhaps we're in danger of something parallel happening. And I think it's important that we keep open to the fact that our own prejudices might be at stake here. I think I was very disturbed to see that yesterday Hillary Clinton said that Trump supporters should be subjected to formal re-indoctrination or something. It seemed a quite unfitting thing. And so I think we should recognize that the dangers could come from us, that we ourselves might be the parvenus. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. No, I think it's an important point. I mean, so much of the critique of the social, right? That comes about through people reading The Human Condition, and then some other stuff really does. It would be helpful, as I think you're pointing out, and to read so many other books of Arendt where she talks about the social, because the social is a very complicated idea in her work, and it's not simply not the political. It has to do with society, and one element of it, and the element that really, I mean, look, this is the first time she's writing about the social and the political, long before The Human Condition. It's about two different ideas of equality, right? Equality of condition in the social, and equality of citizenship rights in the political. And while she is a lifelong fan of and believer in political equality, she thinks social equality is, let's just say, complicated. She's not against it. But as she says here, it's one of the most uncertain and dangerous ventures in society, because no matter how much you try, you're never going to end up with social equality. And so social equality is always going to lead to resentments, angers, and it's always going to lead to the claim of equality when people are not equal. And as she says in that line that I pointed out, there's a 1% chance that things will work out, and a 99% chance that we'll start to make up reasons why the people who aren't equal, and they're not usually good ones. And so I think that is an important point to make, and I'm glad you picked up on it and brought it to our attention. So thank you. Hannah. Hannah, you got to unmute if you haven't. I can't hear you.
I said, thank you so much for going through the chapter as you did and covering each of the three sections. It was extremely helpful. I spent a lot of time reading the chapter, and I did find it very difficult. I wonder a couple of things. First of all, I Googled difference between crime and vice. So I got that, like crime is, in my mind, it's legal, and vice is personal. It's a characteristic, it's immutable. And it really confused me. I guess at a meta level, kind of what I'm wondering is, so she talks about the characteristics, psychological characteristics of Jewishness, you know, and she and you talk about how, why were they so interested in vices? Because they were bored at this turn of the century time in history. So one question is, why were they bored? So drilling down, does it have to do with secularization? What are the sort of greatest forces that relate to this boredom? You know, because that's kind of weird to be theorizing, you know, like that and just say, well, this emerged because they were bored. That, you know, that's not good enough, as I'm sure you'd agree. Second, I mean, not that you said it, but that, you know, she intimates it. But, and then the other thing is, you know, is this a German Jewish perception that is really universal? Like, if you looked at, I mean, we always assign psychological characteristics to people and to groups. Jews used to be thought of in the Middle Ages as hook-nosed, greedy, grubby, children murdering for matzah, killing, you know, people, right? And then they became these other characteristics, etc. So I guess here's a couple of issues. Did secularization, do you think there's any role of secularization at the end? You know, they were bored. Maybe they were bored because the floodgates of belief were breaking down, possibly. Secondly, how, you know, what we're talking about here, of course, is racism. We're talking about racism against Jews. And there's been a lot written recently and in the past since she wrote this chapter about the characteristics of racism. And how do we align this with that? So thank you. And again, Roger, thank you so much for your extremely critical overview.
Thanks. Glad it was helpful, Hannah. So why are they bored? And where does that come from? I mean, you know, you can see this in our contemporary culture too, right? I mean, there are all sorts of minority groups that get their time in the sun, their 15 minutes of fame right now, because they, because there's a sort of joy in learning about them and watching them, and they're sort of a little bit edgy and different, and then, you know, you move on, right? I mean, this is something we see in popular culture. Boredom is not, you know, it was not invented yesterday. That said, you know, for many of the things you mentioned, secularization, the loss of religion and belief, a growing sense of ennui or meaningfulness is quite associated with the rising bourgeoisie, people who, you know, don't really have other values besides making money or earning money, and you know, that might satisfy for a certain amount of time, but there is a sense of what else is there in life, and bringing in you know, some Jewish or gay people to a salon in the 19th century would allow you to feel like, ooh, there's a little, you know, frisson there that I need. It's racist, and yet it has advantages for the Jews and the gays who are brought in, and disadvantages, right? And that's what it is. So, you know, where boredom comes from is a great question. There have been whole books written on it. You know, Martin Heidegger has written a ton on it. Not only him, but it's part of this book as well. We'll talk a lot about what Arendt calls loneliness, metaphysical loneliness in this book, and you know, that's one of the core ideas that she's going to offer as the origin of totalitarianism. And
Wow.
and so we'll get into that as we do. You made an interesting point that when you said that we always psychologize groups, right? And then in the Middle Ages, people said Jews had noses or whatever. No doubt. I think what I would say in response to that is this, that it's at this period that the Jews begin to embrace the same idea of Jewishness, right? I'm not sure that was the case in the Middle Ages. I think in the Middle Ages, the Jews thought this was idiotic. Now the Jews embrace this. They find it helpful because they need both to be Jewish and also not to be Jewish. And they need that mirror. They need that thing to push away.
But these are secularized Jews because, of course, when you're a religious Jew, you don't need any of that because you have your relationship with God and with the rituals and with the liturgy, etc.
Yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, we're talking about largely secularized Jews
right.
who are in the process of assimilating. So,
right.
Absolutely.
Same thing today.
Same thing today. And look, I think you could find interesting comparison. I think one of the things that I found this section to be really great for as a teacher today is talking about race in America, because a lot of the same issues of assimilation around whether it's trans groups or Black groups or whatever it is, I think are talked about in this book with incredible detail and in a way that people don't like to talk about today around race or trans issues or other issues. And this book allows my students to talk about them in that way. Yeah, so I think those are great points. The last point you made about racism against Jews and what is racism, I mean, again, it's something we've talked about and we'll talk more about, but for Arendt, what makes anti-Semitism different from Jew hatred is its ideological status as an ideology, and we'll continue to talk about that as the book goes on. So thank you very much. Jerry, how you doing? Jerry, you're muted, so you got to unmute yourself. Oh, no, now you're muted again. There you go.
Okay, that's all right.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Roger. This is a very rich chapter. You are so right about that. I think Arendt, it's always good, for me anyway, it helps understand to look at what she says at one time from a point of view that maybe she didn't have at that time, but in this case, a little bit later, which I think has already been alluded to. For instance, equality here is so important, as you've made clear. Both in this book and also in our contemporary world, as far as all the racial and some also Semitic problems that are arising and have arisen. But equality, how in general, Arendt doesn't pose this question here, but it is a fundamental question, I think, how unique persons, human beings, each one unique, doesn't matter if it's a Jew, Black, Brown, Christian, Muslim, each individual human being is unique. How can they ever be equal? How is that possible? How can uniqueness go together with equality? Arendt's very complicated and fundamental answer to that question, which is not really dealt with so much. It's certainly suggested in Origins, is the realm of politics, where uniqueness can join with equality. The only place, though, the only place, and that is something very, very, very rich to go into, but not now. The question that came to my mind reading the book and listening to you, Roger, was, cannot a Jew be exceptional and unique and therefore unequal? And the answer to that, curiously, Aaron's answer, and that's what's new about part of what is new about anti-Semitism, is that not in theory to political anti-Semitism. Jews cannot be individuals in a political regime called anti-Semitism, which is untrue of any other political regime. That's why anti-Semitism is not exactly the same as racism for her here. One of many reasons. And that also, it seems to me, brings up the question of the relation between political and social anti-Semitism, because social anti-Semitism admits uniqueness, admits the exceptional Jew. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Gary, can I add? I'm not sure I understood everything, so I just want to make sure. You said, cannot a Jew be exceptional? And then you said, not. I'm not sure I understood what you were trying to get.
Not in political anti-Semitism. It seems to me that's the difference between political and social anti-Semitism. Political anti-Semitism is Nazism, right? It was the Hitler regime. It's what you saw, that totalitarian regime, where part of the totality, the totalitarian in totalitarianism, is that no Jew can be exceptional. Now, maybe that didn't work out for maybe Mr. Einstein got better treatment than Jerome Cohen, say, but that's my point. We were in political. That it is a huge distinction in politics. Jews cannot be equal, or rather, excuse me, they cannot be exceptional.
Right. Yeah. So thank you. Arendt imagines politics as a fiction, right? And the fiction of equality, right? Which she says, of course, people aren't equal, but we have this fictional idea that we treat everyone equal. And that's an important fiction for her. Of course, even in political equality, there's inequality in the sense that if you're an equal citizen of the United States, people who are Mexicans or Venezuelans have a different level of equality, right? And there's always going to be inequality. She doesn't think you can imagine a system without that. The problem, as you're bringing up, is social inequality or social equality, which is something that social inequality matters. You never say social inequality doesn't matter, right? If you're on a subway and people won't talk to you or look at you or move away from you because of what you look like or who you are, this is painful. And she writes about that in the essay "We Refugees." She's certainly not against trying to address social inequality, but but she sees its danger. Your claim that under political anti-Semitism or Nazism, no Jew can be exceptional, I think is right. I'm not sure how that differs from racism. I mean, so under under a racist society, no X can be exceptional. What was your claim that there was a difference between anti-Semitism and racism then? I'm not sure I understood that either.
Let's see. I don't think I did make myself clear because you haven't understood what I meant, Roger.
Well, that could be me, but yeah.
Look, did you say that there's no such thing as political equality?
Well, no, I said that. So Arendt believes in political equality as a fictional idea that we are all.
As a fictional idea?
Well, what she says in Origins in chapter 9 is, the idea of political equality is one of the great inventions. It's an invention, right? I mean, it wasn't always the case.
Roger, all those books you read on violence, civil disobedience, and all of that, it's said over and over and over again that the only place where people can be equal is in the public realm. That is a huge distinction between politics and society and privacy.
Absolutely. All I'm saying is that the idea of the equality in the public realm is not universal. It's a historical accomplishment that happens over time.
Indeed.
And she says
it's potential in the public realm.
It's something that has to be created and made and nurtured and protected. It's not natural. So that's what I meant when I said it was fictional. You have to create it. You have to make it. You have to artifice it if you want. It's not something that you can just assume is natural.
You don't create, you act together. Those are individuals acting together as equals. Unique individuals acting together are equal.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't think you had the idea even and the possibility of doing it until you had people like Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke and others who conceived this idea of political equality. It was something that came about at a particular moment in time. But in any case, that's all I was saying. And then I was also saying that even if one imagines political equality amongst a polis or amongst a community, there are communities outside of that, right? And we have to take serious the fact that all citizenship it requires that there also be people who are not citizens and thus are not politically equal.
Absolutely.
That's all I was saying in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. John.
Hi, thanks. I don't think, to my mind at any rate, that Arendt is really clear about this distinction between vice and crime. So, and this is why I'm not clear on it. First of all, crime is a legal term. It's a violation of statutory law. And a vice is a moral term. It's related to viciousness. It is the predisposition to do wrong or bad. It is the opposite of a virtue. A vice is the opposite of a virtue. A virtue is the predisposition to do something that's consistently and regularly good, however you want to define good, and a vice is the opposite. Okay. Now, she said that they were allowed to assimilate because of a fascination with vice in the fin de siècle Europe, and for the reasons that the bourgeoisie were devoted to making money, and then they realized that that wasn't the meaning of life, and that they became bored with making money and nothing else. And so they became attracted to vice, that is, people who deliberately or habitually do what's wrong. So they're kind of testing the limits of what is moral and what is legal. All right. Now, my question is, what is the crime that Jews were assigned? That is, what is the crime we're talking about? What is the legal violation of the Jews as a people that they were charged with? And, I can see going from crime to vice as being a kind of an interesting cultural play. But what is the crime? What is the crime? It's not clear to me. Now, just one guess, and that is that it goes back to the beginning of the chapter and the footnote that you quoted, namely that the Jews have a principle of isolation or separation, the principle of separation. No other group in the world, and she says this, no other group has a principle of separation as key to their identity. And that may be perceived by others, non-Jews, Gentiles, as a crime. Okay, that's a guess.
Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate your attempts to bring clarity to the words. It's important to do that, and I probably didn't do it in my presentation, so that's important.
But I don't think Arendt does it either. That's why I'm a little concerned.
Crime, you for her, she I think she is quite clear. So let me just say what I think she's clear about. For Arendt, a crime is something that demands to be punished. She's not a lawyer. This is not a law professorial text, right? A crime is something that needs to be punished. A vice is something that is maybe not virtuous and wrong, but doesn't need to be punished. That's her distinction. That may not be how lawyers use it or not, but that's the way she's using it. What are the crimes that the Jews, as Jews, have been accused of? Killing Jesus, money lending, separating and being a nation within a nation, and thus being traitors. And you mentioned that last one as well. The point is that for her, anti-Semitism was originally, we don't associate with these people because they're criminals. They're people who need to be excluded. They're people who need to be expelled or punished or whatever because they are criminals. Not in a legal sense per se, but in a sense that they've done things that need to be punished. Whereas what she's saying is happening in this period is that the mix of equalization and emancipation, where we take away that crime, we begin to say, look, the things we used to call crimes are no longer things that need to be punished and need to be expelled. And in fact, if we can find good people, the right kind of Jews, they still have that taint of vice, criminality, vice, but we can also bring them in. And that's the distinction. The point is that once many Jews find that valuable because they get brought into society and they accept that being a little bit having that frisson or having that criminality without being a criminal, that vice. But what she says is as much as you might think you're bringing people into society and that criminality is no longer an issue, vice is still vice. And at times, the fact that Jews are still associated with not virtuous actions and vice allows them to be persecuted when political anti-Semitism arises. That's the argument. Is that helpful or not, John? I mean, I think it's a pretty clear distinction that crime is what demands to be punished, whereas vices don't need to be punished. That's the distinction she's making.
I understand that. But she's using language and she's talking about crime and vice. And I don't think she's that clear. I mean, I understand what she's doing with it. A crime has to be punished and a vice has to be tolerated or socially shunned. I mean, if someone is a vicious person, that is, has a predisposition to do wrong, then there can be social shunning, and that makes a lot of sense. But a crime is a legal term, and so all right. So the Jews are being held responsible for the murder of Jesus or the execution of Jesus. Well, Jesus was a Jew, all right, and I get that historically and ideologically and culturally and so on, but I have to go back to the footnote where she says that the Jews have a principle of separateness as
part of it too. They're traitors. That's just another way of saying they're traitors.
Traitors to the nation in which they live, all right, or traitors to the Christian world or Christian Europe, something like that. I just want to have that crime identified. And it has to be seen as a crime that needs to be punished. I don't get that from her. So I'm not satisfied with her explanation. That's all.
Okay. Well, look, we don't all have to be, and that's just. But I do think she's identified something meaningful in the distinction of crime and vice. Vivian.
Just to make a note about her use of Proust as a person who loves reading Proust. I value that.
I'm going to do the oven.
Okay, otherwise we could do it.
Oh, hold on. I'm going to mute everybody and then Vivian come back, all right?
All right.
There you go. Come on back.
Okay. I love seeing her refer to Proust and his characters. I only caution to say these characters are fictional characters in a different sense from a social fiction, and Proust uses them. As many of you will know, his mother's family was Jewish and his father's was not. And until he came out as a Dreyfus later on, as she said, he was part of the structure that we have been thinking of in terms of assimilation and difference. But I would like to speak about homosexuality because that in this period is, of course, a borderline crime, a borderline vice, criminalized, as we know, by the imprisonment, say, of Oscar Wilde in England. It's not clear in the world what is a vice, what is a crime, if it is a vice. And so I think that the person who said that the distinctions are less clear than she wants to, than one might think one would expect, is on target there. I could talk about Proust forever, so I won't. But I think that that in terms of thinking what was homosexuality, which in Proust is very clearly a secret, forbidden, but pervasive behavior, is a complex issue for his characters and for his narrator, who in the book is presented as heterosexual himself and discovering this world. But I think the distinctions are not clear in the world of Western culture.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, and it goes back to John's point. I mean,
yes,
the crime and vice. I mean, like Arendt makes all sorts of distinctions in her work between social and political and private, between crime and vice. Obviously, they're not never these are never fully materialized distinctions. They're supposed to be helpful in certain ways.
I think that's right. I think that what she's doing in this book is essayistic. She's trying out, much in some ways like Montaigne, she's trying out these ideas and seeing where they take her in terms of the discoveries she's made in her historical readings and in her philosophical studies too. And to the extent that this is, I think, essayistic writing, it's working through the terrible experiences she herself had had and that she sees around you, and which, when she first heard about the death camps, she and her husband could initially not really believe was happening. So I think it's very powerful working through problems, even where I see that there is unclarity here. Even when I see, but you said that there. And the introduction that Samantha Powers wrote for a recent edition says, even when sometimes she's a human rights leader, she says, even when sometimes you feel like putting it down because it's an overgeneralization or an incomplete conceptualization.
No, yo creo que tienen como una grasa ahí, pero era parte de lo que
Thank you.
Pero no era nada de mareo, no.
Yeah, I just want to add that I fundamentally agree with not only your claim about this book that it can be essayistic, but I think in the end, Arendt is an essayistic writer. And I think that's one of the, my colleague Thomas Wild has certainly brought this out in his writing about Arendt as well. But he and I have long talked about, and I have long held that she is an essayist, which is why I think many of her best works are her essays. And I think she's very much in the tradition of Montaigne. Bob, we got about 6 minutes left, so I just want to try and I got 2 more hands up. I'm going to see if I can get them in. Bob and Harold.
Sure, try to be quick. I've read this book several times, and this last time I'm reading it, it strikes me maybe essayistic, but also novelistic. You've got Disraeli as a character. You've got the Jew as sort of a figure in the story. You have Vice, and you have
Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia is going to make a big appearance.
So there's this panorama of historical figures and historical representations, and maybe it's helpful, not to try and pin her down in some of these concepts, but to read it with the idea in mind that it's somewhat suggestive.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many parts of this book, that you're going to be introduced to personalities, characters. Cecil Rhodes is going to play a huge role in this book, and Lord Cromer and Lawrence of Arabia. So all of these, and I think you're right. On the one hand, this is a book that has to be read as a grand novel, right? And on the other hand, each chapter and each paragraph and each sentence can be analyzed and taken apart, and there's also wisdom in that. And so I think it's a great insight to read it in both ways. I think you can read it in a grand scope, as sort of a novel with impressions about totalitarianism and many other things, and you can also read it as an analytical excursus, which it also is at times. So I would encourage us all to read it in both ways. And I think, one of the advantages of reading it in this group where we read it chapter by chapter is we get to read it very analytically. But I think there's also something really valuable of just sitting down over a couple of weeks. It's a long book, but over a couple of days, if you have some time, and reading the whole thing in one fell swoop. And that's a very useful way to approach it as well. So thank you for that, Bob. Harold, you'll get the last word.
Oh, thank you, Roger. Is my microphone working?
It is.
Okay. So on the issue of the Jewish crime, I think we need to go back to On the Jews and Their Lies, Martin Luther, 1543. And while that seems ancient, but what he proposed in there is stayed alive in the memory and thoughts of people. And what he said is about Jews: moreover, they are nothing but thieves and robbers, who daily eat no morsel and wear no thread of clothing which they have not stolen and pilfered from us by means of their accursed usury. Thus they live from day to day, together with wife and child, by theft and robbery, as arch thieves and robbers, and in the most impertinent security. Moreover, he proposed, what shall we Christians do with the rejected and condemned people, the Jews? And then he goes through a whole list of, set fire to their houses, kill their rabbis. And what I found most interesting, because, I have a whole thing about the Holocaust work that I do within that, is that all of a sudden, every Nazi has a copy of Martin Luther's book, and they're flashing it around. What they did was exactly what Martin Luther told them to do: burn this, burn the books, kill the Jews, put them in concentration camps. All of that goes all the way back to 1542. However, the important part of this is that those are the crimes that I believe she was referring to that are part of the gestalt of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Harold, that's really helpful. I appreciate it. When we were having that conversation, that's what I started with: killing Jesus, thievery, but traitor, etc. But having that list for Martin Luther is helpful. And I think it does remind us about, the way in which anti-Semitism originally saw Jews as criminals in this sense, not legal, but in this, moral or ethical sense. And yet suddenly in the 19th century, there's this possibility for them to be seen not as criminals who need to be killed and etc., but who can be part of our salons. And yet there's a kind of tension in there because we're bringing these former criminals, now vice adherents of vice, into our social world. And that's a big part of what she's after. In any case, thank you all. This was great. Great conversation today. Remember, we're not meeting next week because of the conference. If you can come to the conference, we'd love to have you, or you can tune in and watch it online on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, we return in 2 weeks on the 20th with the chapter 4 on the Dreyfus affair. I look forward to seeing you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Gracias, Professor Roger.
Gracias, profe. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.